Okay guys, in this video we're going to focus primarily on weathering. And if you remember, weathering is the breaking down of rocks, whether it's giant huge rocks like mountains or whether it's small gravel that breaks into even smaller pieces. And this actually covers two standards, but one of which is S6E5F, which says explain the effects of physical processes. So we're going to be talking about the erosion and the deposition and how gravity affect rocks. So I'm going to show you some pictures where these processes have taken place. And these are some pretty cool pictures. And I want you to think about how in the world did these actually happen? Pretty amazing stuff here. Okay, so all of those pictures that you just saw are examples of weathering. Weathering and then erosion, which is the movement of the sediment, and then even deposition, such as you see in this picture here. These sand dunes are created when sand was deposited and dropped off in this location. And I'll go back. This is a delta that formed as this river brought sediment with it, and the sediment was deposited here at the end of the river, so you have a delta. And this is just from wind beating away at that rock and leaving that formation. This is from a glacier actually scraping across the land and breaking down the mountains and leaving what looks like a road, but that's really not a road. And this one, just wind carving away at that rock and leaving that formation. And here you probably have a little bit of wind and water beating against that rock and creating those arches and just breaking it down. And that's very interesting. I'm not sure if I would want to stand out there, but eventually that rock is going to be weathered and it's not going to be there. Hopefully not when they're on it though, right? So I'm going to go back forward. Oh, we forgot this one. This is the Delicate Arch in Arches National Park. So weathering is the process that breaks down rock and other substances at Earth's surface. And so wind has definitely weathered that and created that interesting looking arch there. And this whole park is full of those arches that look like pairs of pants, like some of you say. Weathering, as it says, can wear a mountain down to a hill and can produce strange rock formations like in the previous slide of the arch. So there's two types, and you may have heard about these in elementary school. The first type is mechanical weathering. It's sometimes called physical weathering. They're the same thing. Those are just two different names for it. And then there's chemical weathering. So we're going to look at mechanical weathering first. In mechanical weathering, the rocks are broken apart by physical processes. They heat up, water beats against it, ice gets in it, there are pressures put on them, temperature changes. All of those things are things that happen to the rock physically. But the rock stays the same. If it's made up of, quartz, calcite, and mica, then if it's weathered mechanically, it's still going to be made up of those same minerals. The chemical formula of it doesn't change. It stays the same. When it breaks into pieces, those pieces are just like the original rock, just smaller. Okay, so this is where you're going to get your notes, your types of weathering chart, and these don't come in order, so you're going to have to pay attention. But you can see it's broken down into two sections. The top has mechanical weathering down the side, and there are four types. I'm actually going to talk about a few more than that. And then the bottom half is chemical weathering, and then there's four types listed there as well. All you're doing in this video is writing a description. You're not putting a picture. I'm sorry, you're not writing a description. Let me back up. You should have already written a description, but feel free to change it. You are putting a picture now. You should have done a description when you read the reading passage, but if you felt like you didn't have enough or you didn't quite understand it and you want to write it better in your own words from this video, feel free to. So here's an example of mechanical weathering. This is called frost wedging. On your sheet, it's listed as freezing and thawing. It's the same thing. It's basically when water gets in the crack in a rock, a crack or a crevice. We know that when water freezes, it expands. It expands by about 10%. And so when it expands, it has enough pressure to actually start breaking that rock and pushing it apart. And over time, you get a crack in the rock. So here's that process. So you have the water seeps into the cracks, any sort of crack or fracture in it. The water freezes, it expands about 9%, and that starts to wedge the rock apart. And then if that happens over and over, the rock will eventually break into pieces. It's still the same rock though. That's why it's mechanical weathering. It's not a different kind of rock. It's still the same. Here's an example where frost wedging or freezing and thawing has taken place on this particular rock. And this takes quite a while, so if you were to go out and find a rock in the woods and observe it, it would take many years for you to see a noticeable change. So if you didn't draw a picture of that, you can go back, rewind, and draw a picture of that process happening. Next, this is not on your sheet, but this is called exfoliation. And this is when the outside of the rock gets heated up. Maybe the sun shines on it and it heats it up during the day, and it causes it to expand a little bit. But then at night it gets cold, and so it contracts. And so every day that process happening, getting hot, getting cold, getting hot, getting cold, will eventually cause the outside of the rock to start peeling away. Exfoliation. Girls, you may have heard of exfoliation because you were supposed to exfoliate your face and scrape off the outer layer of the dead skin. So that's kind of what's happening here. The outer layer of the rock is being scraped off, or not scraped off, but just kind of falling off because of the heating and cooling. A fire could also cause exfoliation. If a fire heats up the rock, it would cause that outer layer to basically peel off. So it's kind of showing you here. And this is what exfoliation looks like in nature. Maybe you've seen a rock like that and wondered how it happened, but that's how, because it gets hot during the day and cool at night, and it eventually causes the rock to the outer layer to just shed off. Next is well, and this is one we just talked about. This is not the next. This is the expansion and contraction of rock caused by temperature changes. So that's what we just talked about. During the day, when it's heated up, it will expand. And when it cools down at night, it will contract. Okay, so that's thermal expansion, exfoliation. Here's more on that. I've already talked about this. When rocks are heated up by the sun or fires, that can cause the expansion of the minerals. This will eventually cause the rock to crack apart. On the left, this is a picture of that happening due to a forest fire. So it just breaks off. Okay, here's one that I'm sure you've seen and I'm sure you've noticed. And this is biological weathering. And biological weathering, bio means life. So this is from something that's living. In this particular picture, it is a tree. The tree is alive. The tree has roots, and those roots help to support the tree. Well, those roots will grow anywhere they need to in order to get nutrients, to get water. So sometimes they'll grow into cracks in the rock, and they will actually force the rock apart and cause the rock to break. It's still the same rock. That's why it's mechanical weathering. So those cracks get larger. So here's some pictures, and I'm sure if you've ever paid attention in the woods, you've noticed this. You see things and trees and grasses growing out of rocks all the time. Well, eventually it will cause that rock to break, and it's being weathered, and it's being weathered mechanically because it stays the same rock. That's what I want you to get in your head. It stays the same rock. It looks the same, it's just smaller. Then we have biological weathering from animals, animal actions. Animals burrow, that's how they live, that's where they live, and so they will cause mechanical weathering because when they are digging, they actually loosen the sediment and push it up to the surface, and they break it down even further. They're not going to dig into a solid piece of granite, but they are going to dig into the loose dirt and actually break it down into smaller pieces. So that would be animal actions. Then something rubbing against the rocks can break it down. It's called abrasion. When you fall and skin your knee, that's an abrasion because you rubbed up against the asphalt or the concrete. So here we have wind or other sediment being blown, rubbing up against the rocks, and eventually causes those rocks to break into smaller pieces. So something rubbing the rock, whether it's wind or other sediment or them just getting rubbed together. When the water at the beach, the ocean water, rubs up against the rocks, that's abrasion, because the constant rubbing of that water on the rocks on a rocky beach is breaking it down and creating smaller and smaller rocks until you eventually have sand. So here's some pictures: sand rubbing against a rock, I'm breaking it down, and then other rocks rubbing against one another. So maybe in a creek, the bed of a creek, that's happening. Like I said, at the beach, at the ocean, that's happening as well. So now let's look at chemical weathering. Chemical weathering is a lot different because chemical weathering actually changes what the rock is made of. Some sort of chemical reaction happens and it dissolves or changes the minerals in the rock and changes them into different minerals. So it changes the chemical composition. Acid rain is an example. If there's any acids in the rain and make it acidic, when that rains, it's going to cause the rocks to actually dissolve and turn into different rocks. You've seen this on statues, the Statue of Liberty. You've seen it on monuments. That is acid rain eating away at the rock and changing it into a different type of rock, a different chemical makeup. Another example, probably haven't seen that. I don't think I've ever seen that in nature, but that does happen from acid rain. Now this is a different one. If you've ever been in a cave, you've seen the evidence of chemical weathering called carbonic acid or carbonation. Slightly acidic groundwater, which is the water under the ground where the caves are, dissolves the limestone. The water reacts with carbon dioxide and it creates carbonic acid, and it eats away at the rock and actually creates our caves, which are neat to see, but that is chemical weathering happening. So when you see those stalactites and stalagmites in the cave and all those cave formations, you are seeing the evidence of chemical weathering. The rock is being dissolved and eaten away. Anytime you hear the rock is eaten away or dissolved or a chemical reaction, you know it's going to be chemical weathering. Here's some great examples: cave formations. Then you have plant acids. Some plants, like lichen, actually give off acids that dissolve the rocks. They eat away at the rock and they actually break down. So if you've ever seen lichen on rocks like you see here, then they are eating away at that rock and breaking it down. So it may not be that the lichen is growing in the cracks, but as much that the lichen is creating the cracks. Then we have oxidation. This is when minerals containing iron are exposed to water and oxygen in the air, and it creates rusted rocks. And I'm about to run out of time on this video, so I might have to continue. So minerals like magnetite can actually turn into a new mineral called limonite, which you can definitely see is rusted. So that is oxidation. And that's because of a chemical reaction. This is very different rock than it was before, different mineral makeup.